good evening. As you listen to the sound of my voice, you might begin to notice your breath deepening, slowing. Allow me to be your gentle guide tonight, effortlessly leading you through the peaceful, sun-warmed landscapes of ancient Egypt and into the cool shadows of its greatest temples. The story we are about to explore is not one of pharaohs and great battles, but of a quiet, persistent whisper that has echoed for thousands of years, a story of fantasy and a much more complicated truth. Before we drift too far, if you feel a connection to this place, you're welcome to leave a quiet like or subscribe. Think of it not as a task, but as leaving a soft footprint in the sand before you continue your journey inward. And if you wish, feel free to leave a comment telling me what city you're listening from, and what time it is for you. It's just a quiet way of knowing we're all here, under the same wide, starry sky, even if our clocks are different. And now, with the lights turned down low, and your body feeling heavy and warm, let's simply close our eyes and arrive at the beginning of our journey. The sun is a bruised orange, bleeding into the purple of the horizon. It has been a long, hot day, and the air is finally beginning to lose its fiery breath. You are standing before a set of temple pylons so vast they seem to hold up the sky itself. This is Karnak, or perhaps Dend Array or Edfu. It doesn't quite matter which. The feeling is the same. And a little bit of intimidation. The stone walls, covered in carved figures of gods and kings, are still radiating the day's heat, a gentle warmth against the cooling evening breeze. You're here because you've heard stories, whispers exchanged by foreign travelers in the marketplace, tales told by merchants who have seen more of the world than you have. They speak of the mysteries of the Egyptian gods, of rituals conducted in darkness, and of the women who serve the temple. Women, they say, who offer a unique and divine form of worship, a sacred hospitality that brings a mortal closer to the gods. It's an alluring, scandalous thought, and it's what has drawn you here, to the threshold of the sacred. You walk towards the entrance, a colossal gateway designed to make any human feel small and insignificant. And, you have to admit, it's working. You pass through the first great pylon gate, into a vast open-air courtyard lined with towering columns that look like bundles of papyrus reeds turned to stone. This is as far as most people, the ordinary citizens of Egypt, would ever have been allowed to go. Historians still debate just how exclusive the inner sanctums really were, whether the lines were drawn by social class, spiritual purity, or just the whim of the priests on duty that day. But for tonight, you have a special invitation to drift deeper. You look up at the walls, at the intricate hieroglyphs telling stories of glorious battles and divine births. And you notice something surprising. In a deep groove of a carving, protected from the centuries of sun and wind, you see a flake of brilliant blue paint, a tiny fleck of emerald green beside it. You realize with a little jolt that this entire place was once a riot of color. The images you have in your mind of stately, sand-colored ruins are wrong. This temple was once painted like a comic book, a vibrant, almost gaudy spectacle. A far cry from the monochrome beige we imagine today. As you move further in, the sounds of the world outside begin to fade, replaced by the temple's own quiet hum. You hear the soft slip-slap of bare feet on stone, the distant, rhythmic shaking of a sea-strum, a kind of sacred rattle, and the low murmur of chanting coming from somewhere deep within the complex. You realize this isn't just a place of worship, it's an institution. A massive, self-contained corporation with its own granaries, workshops, and living quarters. It owns vast tracts of farmland up and down the Nile. This temple is a landlord, a bank, and a fortress all rolled into one. The gods, it seems, are in a very profitable business. Dusk has now fully given way to night. Torches are being lit, their flames casting long dancing shadows that make the carved gods on the walls seem to writhe and breathe. Figures in clean, white linen robes move with purpose through the courtyards. Some are priests, their heads shaved, their faces serene and unreadable. Others are clearly workers, carrying jars of water, bundles of reeds, or trays of offerings. And among them, you see the women. Some carry intricately braided, others are sweeping the floors, their movements practiced and weary. They are the reason you are here, the subject of those tantalizing rumors. As you watch them move through the flickering torchlight, You wonder which of them are the sacred servants you've heard about, which of them hold the temple's deepest, most intimate secrets. The stories made them sound like mythical beings, priestesses of pleasure. But here, in the growing dark, they just look like people with a job to do. A quiet, profound gap opens up between the wild fantasy you heard and the mundane reality you see, and it is in that gap that our story truly begins. A priest, his white linen robe seeming to glow in the torchlight, notices your lingering presence. He gives you a slow, almost imperceptible nod and gestures towards a smaller, more intimate part of the temple complex. You follow, your footsteps echoing softly behind his. You move out of the grand hypostyle hall, with its forest of giant columns, and into a space that feels different, warmer. The columns here are not simple cylinders of stone, they are carved in the shape of women. Their faces serene and beautiful, their heads crowned with a unique hairstyle and, strangely, the ears of a cow. Above their heads, they support the temple ceiling. You've entered a chapel dedicated to the goddess Hathor. And here the atmosphere shifts. If the main temple is a place of imposing state power and solemn ritual, this corner feels dedicated to something more personal, more joyful. The air is thick with the scent of lilies and frankincense. And in the central shrine, you see her statue. Not a terrifying jackal-headed god or a majestic falcon, but a woman, graceful and poised. Her form is human, but she wears a crown of cow horn, cradling a glowing sun disk between them. Sometimes she is depicted simply as a cow, patient and nurturing, the great mother of the sky. This is Hathor, and to understand the myth we are chasing, you must first understand her. She is one of Egypt's oldest and most complex deities. The priest begins a low, rhythmic chant in her honor, and you catch titles as they drift by: Lady of the Sky, Mistress of the West, but she is most famously known as the goddess of love, beauty, music, dance, and motherhood. She is the divine patron of joy. The women you saw earlier with the sea strums, those sacred rattles, were her priestesses. You now hear the sound up close, a gentle, percussive shimmering. It's a sound meant to evoke the rustling of papyrus reeds in the wind, a sound believed to soothe the gods and drive away malevolent spirits. But there's another, more intoxicating side to Hathor. She is also the mistress of drunkenness. This isn't a modern, negative judgment. For the Egyptians, intoxication, specifically with beer and wine, could be a sacred act, a way to break down the barriers between the mortal and the divine, to achieve a state of religious ecstasy. And this is rooted in one of their most dramatic myths. The story goes that the sun god Ra grew angry with humanity's disobedience. He sent his enforcer, the fearsome lioness goddess Sekhmet, to punish them. But Sekhmet went too far, her bloodlust threatening to wipe out all of humanity. To stop her, Ra ordered that 7,000 jars of beer be brewed and dyed red with pomegranate juice to look like blood. The mixture was poured out over the fields. Sekhmet, thinking it was a great pool of blood, drank it all, became blissfully intoxicated, and fell asleep. When she had transformed into the gentle, loving Hathor. To honor this myth, the Egyptians celebrated great festivals of drunkenness. These were not sordid affairs but massive, state-sponsored religious events. People would gather at temples like this one to drink, feast, sing, and dance in a reenactment of the myth, celebrating humanity's salvation. Just how wild these festivals became is a topic of intense debate among Egyptologists. Some surviving texts and poems from the period are surprisingly explicit, describing people coupling in the fields and celebrating with a freedom that seems shocking. But were these poetic exaggerations a kind of ritualized fantasy, or were they a literal description of events? We simply don't have a definitive answer. It's possible these were highly controlled rituals, where ecstatic behavior was confined to a specific time and place, a safe outlet for a society that was otherwise quite structured. But you can easily imagine how a foreign visitor, someone from, say, Greece, might witness such a festival. They wouldn't understand the complex mythology behind it. They would just see an entire community engaged in state-sanctioned drinking, singing sensual hymns to a goddess of love, with music and dancing that went on all night. They might see men and women, their inhibitions lowered by beer, celebrating with an openness that was foreign to their own culture. It's in this heady, intoxicating mix of sacred beer, sensual music, and a genuinely complex goddess of love and joy, that the fertile soil for a great misunderstanding was prepared. The image of the sacred prostitute isn't created from nothing. It is a distortion, a funhouse mirror reflection of something that was, in its own context, profoundly religious. You now understand the goddess at the center of the rumors. All that's needed now is an outsider to see the spectacle, miss the point entirely, and write it all down for future generations to read. The last echoes of the sea strums fade, and the heady scent of temple incense gives way to the more earthly smells of the morning riverbank, damp earth, blooming lotus flowers, and the faint, dusty aroma of a village waking up. The dreamlike quality of the night recedes, replaced by the sharp, clear light of an Egyptian dawn. You find yourself standing near the docks of a bustling trading town, a place where the slow, ancient rhythm of Egypt meets the fast-paced, noisy world of the Mediterranean. Papier skiffs and heavy-bottomed barges jostle for space with sleek, strange-looking ships, their single square sails bearing the markings of foreign ports. It is from one of these foreign ships that a man disembarks. He is clearly not Egyptian. His tunic is shorter, his beard is thick and trimmed in a different style, and his skin has been kissed by the Egyptian sun for nearly as long as the locals. He has an air of intense, almost childlike curiosity, his eyes darting everywhere, taking in the chaos of the port, the unusual animals, the architecture so alien to his own. In his hands, he carries not a merchant's ledger, but a set of wax tablets and a stylus. He is not here to trade goods, but to collect stories. You are looking at Herodotus of Halicarnassus, the Greek traveler from the 5th century BC. And let's be clear, this man is essentially on the world's first ever long-form journalism assignment. He has an insatiable curiosity and has set out to write a grand account of the world as he knows it, particularly the great clash between the Greek world and the Persian Empire. But to do that, he feels he must first understand the ancient, mysterious land of Egypt, a culture that was already ancient when his own was just getting started. We call him the father of history, but it might be more accurate to call him the father of asking awkward questions. His method is simple. He travels, he observes, and he asks questions. Lots of them. If a local guide tells him the pyramids were built by 100,000 slaves over 20 years, that goes in the book too. And this is where the trouble starts. Historians and archaeologists have spent centuries in a heated debate about Herodotus. Was he a brilliant investigative reporter doing his best with the tools he had? Or was he a bit of a gullible tourist, diligently writing down every tall tale his guide spun for him to get a bigger tip? As you watch him, you see his cultural confusion in real time. He notes with amazement that in Egypt, women go to the market and conduct business while men often stay at home to weave. To a Greek man, for whom a respectable woman's place was strictly in the home, this is a world turned upside down. He is fascinated by their worship of animals, finding it both bizarre and profound that they would mummify a cat or revere a bull. He tries to make sense of it all by mapping their gods onto his own. The Egyptian god Ammon must be Zeus. Osiris is clearly their version of Dionysus, and so on. It's a game of celestial snap that can lead to some very strange conclusions. Here's a little detail that shows his mindset. He found it utterly baffling that the Egyptians wrote from right to left, while the Greeks wrote from left to right. He presents this not as a simple cultural difference, but as yet another example of the Egyptians doing everything in reverse. This is the lens through which he sees everything. He is not a neutral observer. He is a Greek man, comparing everything he sees to the standards and customs of his home. And his home is a world where transcational sex, sometimes in a religious context, was a known, if often looked down upon reality. Certain temples to Aphrodite in places like Corinth were known for their priestess prostitutes. So here he is, a curious outsider, already convinced that Egypt is a land of reversals and strange customs, equipped with a historical method that relies heavily on hearsay, and carrying cultural baggage that includes the concept of temple prostitution. He is a walking, talking confirmation bias, a perfect vessel for a sensational rumor. All he needs is for someone, a low-level priest with a mischievous streak, or a world-weary tour guide on the docks, to lean in and whisper a particularly juicy story about what really goes on in the temples of the goddess of love after dark. And you can almost see him leaning in, stylus poised, ready to believe every single word. The sun is high and hot now, beating down on the sandstone plaza. The curious Greek traveler, Herodotus, has found what he was looking for, a source. He is sitting in the shade of a colonnade, sharing a small cup of sweet date wine with a man you recognize as a low-level temple functionary. Perhaps a chiesa scribe or a reader priest, one of the many cogs in the great machine of the temple. He has the shaved head of the priesthood, but his linen robe is not as fine as the one worn by the high priest you saw last night. There's a glint in this man's eye, a mix of pride in his culture and a performer's delight in having a captivated audience. You drift closer, a silent observer, and you listen to the story HES spinning for the eager foreigner. He isn't speaking of grand theology or the complex symbolism of Hathor. He is telling a much more scandalous, much more human tale. He gestures towards the temple, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He speaks of a special class of women, chosen for their beauty and grace, consecrated to the service of the goddess. He describes them not as musicians or weavers, but as vessels of the goddess's divine energy. He explains that for a pilgrim, a traveler, or a wealthy patron seeking the goddess's favor, there is a way to receive a more direct blessing. The scribe explains that these women welcome men into sacred, private chambers within the temple grounds. There, in an act that is part prayer, part physical union, the worshipper can connect with the divine feminine. The payment offered for this service, he says, is not a vulgar commercial transaction. It is a holy offering, a donation to the temple that sanctifies the act. It is a way for a man to show his devotion and, in return, receive a taste of heavenly pleasure, all under the benevolent, watchful eye of the goddess of love herself. He might even add a detail about how the children from these unions are considered special, raised within the temple walls as servants of the gods from birth. You watch Herodotus, and he is utterly enthralled. This is exactly the kind of story he loves. It's exotic, it's a little shocking, and it fits perfectly with his preconceived notion of Egypt as a land of strange reversals. He furiously scratches notes onto his wax tablet, his time at beginning the whole story. The scribe might be using an Egyptian word that has multiple meanings, a word that could mean servant or musician, but also has a more risque connotation. Much like the word mistress in English can mean different things depending on the context. The chain of translators eager to please their client likely choose the most sensational interpretation. And so, the rumor you heard in the marketplace is now being given the stamp of semi-official confirmation. But then you pull back, and you look at the scene from a different angle. You see the temple complex as a whole. You see hundreds of people at work. Women are grinding grain in a courtyard, their arms strong and dusty with flour. Men are tending to the sacred cattle in their pens, their voices low and soothing. Scribes are in a library, meticulously copying texts onto fresh rolls of papiers. It is a place of immense, organized labor. And the story the priest is telling simply doesn't seem to fit. Where are these sacred chambers he speaks of? Archaeologists have excavated temple after temple, and while they found priests' quarters, kitchens, granaries, and workshops, they've never found a wing of rooms that looks anything like a divinely sanctioned brothel. You also think about the women themselves. To be a temple musician, one of Hathor's performers, was a respected position. These women were often from good families. The idea that they would also be expected to perform this other, more intimate service seems like a strange contradiction. Yet, the story is incredibly compelling. It has all the elements of a great tale. Sex, religion, and the allure of a hidden, secret world. It's easy to see why someone would want to believe it. And even easier to see why someone would want to tell it, whether the scribe is telling a genuine, albeit misunderstood, piece of local folklore, or if he's just having a bit of fun at the expense of a gullible foreigner, is a question that historians have been asking ever since. But the damage, as they say, is done. The seed of the myth has been planted. The whisper has been written down. The whisper has been written down. And once something is written down by a man who will later be called the father of history, it takes on a life of its own, a life that will last for millennia. The wax tablet, with its freshly scratched notes, has now traveled across the sea. The dust of Egypt has been replaced by the salty air of the Aegean. You find yourself in a Greek symposium, a private party for the educated and wealthy. Men, draped in fine wool, recline on couches, sipping wine mixed with water from a large, ornate crater in the center of the room. The air is filled with the sounds of a clear and lively, intelligent debate. This is the environment where Herodotus says stories. His histories are first shared. He is an ancient celebrity, a storyteller who has seen the wonders of the world, and his public readings are major events. Tonight he is recounting his travels in Egypt, and he has reached the part about the temples. He tells the story he heard from the scribe, and a hush falls over the room. The men lean forward, their wine cups forgotten. He paints the picture for them, but now it is filtered through his own Greek imagination and tailored for his specific audience. The story transforms. The women in the temple are no longer just Egyptian temple workers. They become priestesses of a sensual cult, figures of mysterious, exotic allure. The act is no longer a strange local custom. It is a rite of divine ecstasy, a sacred performance. You might compare them to the hetairai of Athens, highly educated courtesans who were among the few women in Greek society who could engage with men on an intellectual level. But he would add a crucial twist. These Egyptian women were doing so not for personal gain, but in the service of their goddess. This makes the concept both more scandalous and, strangely, more noble in the eyes of his listeners. It's not just commerce, it's devotion. The temple becomes a place of otherworldly pleasure, a fantasy realm where the strict rules of their own society do not apply. As the centuries pass, the story gets told and retold, written down by other authors, always with a new layer of embellishment. The Roman poet Ovid, a man who was certainly no stranger to writing about love and seduction, would likely have adored such a concept. In the hands of Roman writers, the Egyptian goddess Isis, who becomes conflated with Hathor and Aphrodite, is seen as the patroness of all things wild and passionate. Her temples in Rome gain a reputation, largely undeserved, as places of secret trysts and moral laxity. The myth grows, detaching itself completely from its hazy origins on a hot afternoon in an Egyptian temple courtyard. It is no longer a traveler's tale, it is becoming accepted as historical fact. Now let's fast forward through time, and you can see the myth taking on its most romantic and enduring form. You are in the 19th century in the dimly lit, wood-paneled study of a European gentleman scholar. The room is filled with artifacts brought back from colonial adventures, a dusty piece of pottery, a faded papyrus fragment under glass. The air smells of old paper, leather bindings, and pipe smoke. This is the age of Orientalist, where the East, a vast and vaguely defined region including Egypt and the Middle East, is seen as a place of languid sensuality, ancient mystery, and moral decadence, a perfect counterpoint to the rigid, but undubbed propriety of Victorian Europe. For these scholars, the starlit prostitute is not just a historical curiosity, it's a titillating fantasy that confirms all their prejudices. They imagine these priestesses as tragic, beautiful figures, draped in sheer linen and coal liner, living lives of poetic sin. They write novels, paint pictures, and compose operas about them. The sacred prostitute becomes a stock character, the exotic temple dancer, the doomed priestess who falls in love with a foreign adventurer, the beautiful woman who is both pure and profane. She is a perfect vessel for all the repressed desires and colonial fantasies of the era. She represents a world that is both spiritually profound and sexually available, an irresistible combination. This is the fully formed, alluring myth. It's the version that will eventually be picked up by early Hollywood, splashed across the silver screen in epic films with casts of thousands. It is a powerful, captivating image, a beautiful woman, a servant to the gods who offers her body as a form of prayer, a living sacrifice in the temple of love. It's a story of divine purpose, of sensuality intertwined with spirituality, of a hidden world operating by its own sacred rules. And like all the most beautiful lies, it is far more exciting than the quiet, complicated, and often mundane truth. You've now seen the full, glorious fantasy. The next step is to begin dismantling it, piece by piece. Let's leave the romantic haze of the 19th century studying the glamour of the Hollywood soundstage behind. We need to go back to the source. You find yourself not in a grand temple this time, but in a much more austere setting, the quiet, climate-controlled archives of a modern museum's Egyptology department. The air smells faintly of preservation chemicals and old paper. All around you are shelves, not of golden treasures, but of academic journals, dictionaries of Middle Egyptian, and transcriptions of ancient texts. This is where the myth comes to be unraveled, not with a dramatic discovery, but with the quiet, patient work of scholars. The investigation begins with a single word, or rather a handful of words that have been at the center of this whole misunderstanding. You are looking over the shoulder of a linguist at a papyrus fragment. It's a temple roster, a list of personnel and their duties. She points to a recurring phrase, a title given to certain women working in the temple. In the original Egyptian hieroglyphs, it might be something like Kehi Kretnesu. For centuries, travelers and early Egyptologists, working with limited knowledge, had a guess at what this meant. Kehi Kret could be related to a word for adornment, and Nesu means king. So they translated it as royal adornment, or king's court scene, a title that immediately conjures images of luxury, intimacy, and royal favor. It sounds exactly like the kind of woman who would be involved in sacred sexuality. But as our understanding of the ancient Egyptian language has deepened, a much less glamorous picture has emerged. Modern linguists, by comparing this phrase to its use in hundreds of other contexts, have proposed a very different translation. They now believe Kehi Kretnesu simply meant a royal hairdresser, or ornament maker, a skilled artisan, certainly a respected position in the royal court, or a high-status temple, but a world away from the fantasies of a sacred prostitute. The adornment was not her own seductive beauty, but the intricate wigs and jewelry she created for others, and this is just one example. You look at another term often found in text from the later periods of Egyptian history, when Greek and Roman influence was growing. The Greek word hierodule, which literally means sacred servant or temple slave, starts to appear in documents. When early European scholars saw this word, they immediately jumped to a conclusion. For them, reading their own cultural history backwards, a sacred servant at a temple of a love goddess could only mean one thing. A closer look reveals a more complicated reality. The term hierodule was a broad one. It could refer to anyone who was legally bound to the temple. This included everyone from high-ranking priests to the stonemasons repairing the walls, the farmers tilling the temple's lands, and the women who wove linen for the god's statues. Many of these people were, in fact, slaves, either prisoners of war or people born into servitude. So yes, these women were temple slaves, but there is absolutely no textual evidence to suggest that their servitude specifically involved sexual duties as part of a religious rite. To assume so is to make a massive, unsubstantiated leap. This is a recurring problem that scholars are still trying to untangle. The Egyptians themselves didn't have a single, unambiguous word for prostitute, in the modern sense. They had terms for different kinds of entertainers, dancers, and musicians, some of which may have had sexual connotations in certain contexts. But there is a huge difference between a secular entertainer who might sometimes exchange sex for money and a religiously ordained priestess performing sex as a sacred duty. The myth conflates these two completely different ideas. It's like finding an ancient Roman text that mentions an actress and immediately concluding, she must have been a Vestal virgin. The categories are simply wrong. You realize the entire grand, romantic myth might be built on the linguistic equivalent of quicksand. A few poorly understood titles, a couple of ambiguous poetic phrases, and one Greek word translated through a lens of cultural bias. That's it. It's a sobering thought. The whole fantasy, the beautiful priestess in her sheer linen robes, might just be a ghost, a phantom conjured out of a series of simple, centuries-old mistranslations. The story is beginning to crumble, not because of a dramatic discovery, but because of the slow, meticulous work of someone learning to read an ancient language more accurately. The dusty papyrus scrolls are rolled up and put away. You leave the quiet of the linguist's office and step into a different kind of space. It's a vast, cavernous museum gallery. The air is still and cool. All around you, in climate-controlled glass cases, are the primary sources themselves: painted coffins, jewelry, household objects, and fragments of temple walls, covered in the intricate picture writing of the ancient Egyptians. If the story of the sacred prostitute were true, if it were a genuine and important part of their religious life, the evidence should be here, somewhere. So you begin to search. You walk past endless displays, your eyes scanning thousands of images. Egyptian art, especially temple and tomb art, was not about creative expression in the modern sense. It was functional. It was a visual database of their reality and their beliefs, designed to magically sustain the deceased in the afterlife or to perpetuate the correct rituals for the gods. They carved and painted everything they considered important: the king smiting his enemies, the gods receiving offerings, farmers harvesting grain, brewers making beer, musicians playing harps, women mourning at a funeral. Their entire world is here, laid out in intricate, colorful detail. You look closely at the temple scenes. You see rows of priests, their arms raised in adoration. You see the pharaoh, the sole intermediary between gods and mortals, presenting gifts of incense, bread, and wine. You see goddesses like Isis and Hathor embracing the king, offering him the ankh, the symbol of life. You see scenes from the great festivals, with processions of people carrying divine statues in golden boats. There are countless images of the women we've spoken about. You see them shaking the sea strum, their bodies often depicted in graceful fluid lines. You see them playing the harp and the lute, their heads bent in concentration. You see them as professional mourners, their arms thrown up in ritualized grief. They are everywhere, but you never see the one image you are looking for. Nowhere in the vast and incredibly detailed library of Egyptian art is there a single depiction of the act that Herodotus' informant described. There are no scenes of a priestess welcoming a man into a sacred chamber. There are no carvings of a sexual rite being performed before a statue of a god. It's a stunning and profound absence. The Egyptians were not shy about depicting sexuality. In some private tombs and on a few bawdy satirical papier, there are very explicit images of lovemaking. Almost comical scroll, known as the Turin erotic papiers, shows men and women in a variety of acrobatic positions. So they were perfectly capable of depicting sex. They just never, ever depicted it in a religious context as an act of temple worship. The search continues. You move from the art to the texts. Thousands of documents have survived from ancient Egypt: legal contracts, ledgers, poems, medical texts, and religious hymns. You sift through them, looking for a mention, a description, a law, a hymn, anything that confirms the practice of sacred prostitution. Again, you find nothing. There are marriage contracts that emphasize fidelity. There are legal texts dealing with adultery, which was considered a serious transgression. There are love poems that are incredibly sensual and romantic, celebrating the beauty of a beloved. But there is a complete and total silence on the subject of any kind of religiously sanctioned transcational sex. This lack of evidence is so complete that it has become the central argument for most modern Egyptologists who reject the myth. The debate is, of course, ongoing. A few scholars still argue that this was a secret, esoteric rite, a mystery of the cult that would never have been written down or depicted publicly. They argue that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But that becomes a difficult position to defend. They recorded the daily rations for pyramid workers. They inscribed the most obscure magical spells on the inside of coffins. The idea that a widespread, important religious practice would exist for centuries and leave not a single unambiguous trace in their art, their religious texts, or their legal documents becomes almost impossible to believe. You stand in the middle of the quiet gallery, surrounded by the authentic voices of the Egyptians themselves, frozen in stone and ink. And they are all telling you the same thing through their silence. The story you heard, the myth that has been passed down for 2,500 years, simply doesn't match the world they so carefully recorded. It's like looking for a description of a dragon in a modern zoology textbook. The more you read, the more you realize, the creature you're searching for might not have existed at all. You step out of the silent, sterile world of the museum and back into the living, breathing landscape of ancient Egypt. But this time you're not in a grand temple or a bustling port. You are in a quiet village, nestled among palm trees and fields of barley that stretch to the banks of the Nile. The houses are made of sun-dried mud brick, cool and dark on the inside. Children are playing in the dusty laneways, and the air is filled with the sounds of everyday life, the braying of a donkey, the rhythmic thud of a woman grinding grain with a stone, the murmur of neighbors gossiping over a low wall. This is the world where the vast majority of Egyptians lived and died. And to truly understand why the myth of the sacred prostitute is so unlikely, you have to understand the values of this society. You find yourself invited into a family home. It's a modest dwelling, but clean and orderly. A man is outside, repairing a fishing net. Inside, a woman is baking flatbread on a hot clay plate. Several generations of the same family live together under this one roof. The central pillar of their society was the concept of mayat. This is a word that is often translated as truth or justice, but it's much more than that. Mayat is the cosmic order, the fundamental balance of the universe, the way things are supposed to be. Living in accordance with mayat meant being truthful, dealing fairly with your neighbors, honoring the gods, and crucially, maintaining a stable and orderly family life. For the ancient Egyptians, the family was the essential building block of a healthy society. Marriage was not a grand religious ceremony, but a simple social agreement. A man and a woman would set up a house together, and that was that. We have their marriage contracts, and they are surprisingly pragmatic. They are essentially legal documents that lay out the financial arrangements, what property the wife is bringing into the marriage which, importantly, remained hers, and what she is entitled to if the marriage ends in divorce. And yes, divorce was a relatively straightforward option for both men and women, another surprising bit of modernity. But the social ideal, the life that was celebrated in their art and their wisdom texts, moral guidebooks for young men, was a stable, loving, monogamous marriage. You can almost hear the voice of an old scribe, Tehotep, advising a young man thousands of years ago, if you are a man of consequence, you should found your household and love your wife at home, as is fitting. Fill her belly, clothe her back, make her heart glad as long as you live. This was the gold standard. The tomb paintings don't show a man surrounded by a harem of temple courtesans in the afterlife. They show him with his one wife, and their children by his side forever. Adultery, particularly on the part of a married woman, was considered a very serious offense, a disruption of mayat. The punishments described in some texts were severe. A famous fictional story, The Tale of the Two Brothers, involves a false accusation of adultery, and the chaos it unleashes is a clear cautionary tale. Now, whether these harsh punishments were regularly carried out is a matter of historical debate. Legal reality is often very different from the moralizing of storytellers, but the stories show us the social ideal, the moral code they aspired to. This brings us back to the temple. If this strong social emphasis on marital fidelity and a stable family unit was the norm, the idea of an officially sanctioned religious institution providing sexual services seems jarringly out of place. It would have been a direct contradiction of the very concept of mayat that the temples were supposed to uphold. It's one thing to have a wild, contained festival once a year to honor a myth. It's quite another to have an established, year-round practice that seems to undermine the core social values of your entire civilization. Of course, human societies are complex and often contradictory. It's not impossible that this practice existed in some hidden corner, but it would have been a glaring exception to everything else we know about how they lived and what they believed. You look at the family in the mud brick house, the husband, the wife, the children, the grandparents, and you see a social structure built on order, continuity, and peer responsibilities. It is a world that seems to have very little room for the kind of sacred, chaotic sensuality that the Greek traveler so eagerly imagined. The myth doesn't just lack physical evidence, it clashes with the fundamental social and moral DNA of the Egyptian people. The quiet domestic scene of the village fades, and you find yourself once again in the grand forecourt of a temple. But this time, it's not a quiet evening of mysterious rituals. It's the middle of the day, and the place is packed. The air is electric with excitement and noise. This is one of those great religious festivals you heard about, perhaps the beautiful Feast of the Valley or the Festival of Opit. And you're about to see what one of these events was actually like. Forget the lurid fantasies of a foreign historian, this is the reality. And the reality is something much closer to a massive, chaotic, and joyous community block party. Entire families are here, from the oldest grandfather to the smallest child. They've bought their own food and, more importantly, their own beer. People are sitting on mats in the shade of the towering columns, sharing meals, laughing, and catching up on gossip. It feels less like a solemn religious service and more like a public holiday, a sacred tailgate party. The temple was just a place of worship. It was the center of community life. And these festivals were the moments when the divine and the mundane worlds collided, in the most public and celebratory way. Suddenly a great cheer goes up from the crowd. A procession is emerging from the temple's inner sanctuary. At its head are priests, their white robes immaculate, swinging censers that release thick clouds of fragrant incense. Behind them come the temple musicians, the women of heart as cold, shaking their seized drums, creating that signature shimmering, rustling sound that now fills the entire courtyard. It's hypnotic, a wave of sacred sound washing over the crowd. It's a full-blown parade. And then you see the main event. Carried on the shoulders of a dozen priests is a golden bark, a ceremonial boat. Resting in the center of the boat, hidden from view by a linen veil, is the cult statue of the god himself, Amun-Ra, the king of the gods. Normally, this statue lives in Himmel's holiest chamber, seen only by the highest-ranking priests. But on festival days like this, the god comes out to visit his people. The crowd surges forward, trying to get closer. People shout out prayers, they ask for blessings, they seek divine guidance. Some would pose questions to the god, and the priests carrying the bark would interpret a dip or a sway of the boat as a yes or no answer. Whether this was genuine divine communication or a bit of priestly stagecraft is, naturally, a subject of ongoing academic argument. The procession moves slowly through the crowd and out of the temple gates. It will travel to another temple, visiting the shrine of another god, before returning at sunset. The people follow, singing and clapping. It's a noisy, vibrant, and deeply communal experience. And yes, there is a lot of drinking. We have texts that describe people getting happily drunk for Hatha. The beer and wine flowed freely, and the social atmosphere was one of licensed revelry. Inhibitions were certainly lowered, but what you are witnessing is not a descent into a orgy. It's a form of collective, ecstatic worship. The intoxication is the point. It's a way for the entire community, together, to touch the divine, to momentarily dissolve the rigid structures of everyday life in a shared experience of joy and release. You notice something else. This is all happening out in the open under the bright Egyptian sun, in front of thousands of witnesses. There is nothing secret or hidden about it. The scandalous tales you heard spoke of private rituals in secret chambers. But the ecstatic core of Egyptian worship, as you're seeing it now, was profoundly public. It was about community, not about community, not about community, not about community, not about private, esoteric encounters between an individual and a priestess. As the afternoon wears on and the beer takes its effect, the atmosphere certainly becomes more relaxed, more boisterous. A young man might flirt with a young woman more openly than he would on a normal day. A group of friends might break into a slightly bawdy song. But it's all within the bounds of a community celebration. You see no evidence of an organized system of sacred prostitution. There are no special tents set up for pilgrims, no temple officials collecting offerings in exchange for intimacy. There are just people celebrating their gods, their community, and their good fortune to have a day off work with plenty of food and drink. The reality of the festival is so much more human, so much less mysterious than the myth ever suggested. The foreigner who saw this and imagined a sacred brothel wasn't just mistaken. He was missing the entire point of the party. The sounds of the Egyptian festival begin to fade, the rhythmic shaking of the sea strums replaced by a different kind of music, a different kind of voice. You find yourself back with our Greek traveler Herodotus, but you are no longer in Egypt. You are listening to him recount a story from a different land, a place he seems to find even more strange and exotic, the great city of Babylon, in Mesopotamia. He is describing a custom that, he claims, is the most shameful of all the Babylonian laws. He tells the story with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. He says that every local woman, once in her life, is required to go to the temple of a goddess he calls Mylite, his Greek equivalent for the Babylonian Ishtar or the Sumerian Inanna. There, she must sit in the sacred precinct and wait. She is not allowed to go home until a strange man, or foreigner, throws a silver coin into her lap and says the words, "I invite you in the name of the goddess Mylite." The coin, he insists, can be of any value, but it cannot be refused for it is sacred. After the man has thrown the coin, she must follow him outside the temple grounds and be with him. Once she has fulfilled this duty to the goddess, she is free to go home and is never again available in this way. He adds details that make the story even more vivid. He says that the beautiful women are chosen quickly and get to go home, while the less attractive ones can be stuck waiting in the temple precinct for years. A truly miserable fate. It's a shocking story, a powerful image of a bizarre and, to his Greek sensibilities, deeply degrading custom. And for centuries, this very passage from Herodotus was held up as the ultimate proof of the existence of institutionalized sacred prostitution in the ancient world. If it happened in Babylon, the reasoning went, it must have happened in other, similar cultures like Egypt. But here is the crucial twist, the sleight of hand that has confused the issue for millennia. You are realizing that Herodotus, the very man who is our primary source for the whispers about Egypt, tells his most detailed, most explicit story on this subject not about Egypt, but about Babylon. When he talks about Egypt, his comments are vague, based on what he was told. But when he talks about Babylon, he presents this as a concrete fact, a universal law of their society. The problem? Modern historians and archaeologists who specialize in Mesopotamia have the same issue that the Egyptologists do. They can't find any corroborating evidence for Herodotus' claim. There are no Babylonian legal texts that mention this law. There are no temple records that describe this practice. No local Mesopotamian writer ever refers to it. Once again, it seems to be a sensational story told by an outsider that has no backing in the native sources. In fact, many scholars now believe Herodotus may have profoundly misunderstood a much more complex Mesopotamian ritual, or that he was simply repeating a slanderous piece of anti-Babylonian propaganda that was common in the Greek world at the time. The entire account is now viewed with extreme skepticism, so let's untangle this. The most famous and detailed account of sacred prostitution from our star witness, Herodotus, is about Babylon, not Egypt. And that Babylonian story is itself highly questionable. The evidence for the practice in Egypt is, as we have seen, virtually non-existent. What has happened over the centuries is a strange historical bleed-through. Later, Greek and Roman writers, followed by European scholars, read Herodotus' lurid tale about Babylon and his vague whispers about Egypt, and they mentally merged the two. They took the detailed fantasy from one culture and pasted it onto the other, creating a composite myth that was stronger and more believable than either of its individual parts. You can almost picture it like a flawed police investigation. The detective has a vague, unsubstantiated rumor about suspect A Egypt. He also has a very detailed, but ultimately unreliable, eyewitness account about suspect B Babylon. In his final report, he combines the two, writing that suspect A definitely committed the crime and then using the details from suspect B's file to flesh out the story and make it sound convincing. A blurring of lines that has led the investigation down the wrong path for over 2,000 years. The connection between Egypt and sacred prostitution isn't found in the temples of the Nile. It's found in the pages of a Greek book where two separate, and likely false, stories were allowed to become one. Let's return to the temple precinct in Egypt. We have spent enough time chasing the phantom of the sacred prostitute. It's time to meet the real women who held power and influence here. The crowd from the festival has dispersed, and a hush has fallen over the great courtyards. You are guided away from the chapels of Hathor and into the heart of the main temple complex, the domain of the state god Amun-Ra. This is the religious, political, and economic center of the entire empire. And here you will meet a woman who held a title of almost unimaginable power, a woman who puts the lie to the idea that temple women were merely beautiful servants. You enter a lavishly appointed section of the temple grounds, almost a palace within the palace of the god. In a tranquil garden, cooled by a shady pool, a woman sits on an ornate chair. She is attended by a host of servants, both male and female. Her dress is of the finest, sheerest linen, and she is adorned with gold and lapis lazuli. But it is not her wealth that commands attention. It is her air of absolute authority. This is a woman who is used to being obeyed. You are in the presence of the woman who holds the title Hemet-Net-Jer in Ammon, the god's wife of Ammon. During certain periods of Egyptian history, particularly in the New Kingdom and the Third Intermediate Period, the god's wife of Ammon was one of the most powerful people in the country. Initially, the title was held by a royal woman, a queen or a princess, and it was a high-status religious role. But over time, it evolved into something much more. The god's wife became the high priestess of the most important cult in Egypt. She was not a consort to the pharaoh, in a spiritual sense. She was considered the wife of the god Ammon himself. This divine marriage gave her immense theological importance. On temple reliefs, she is shown performing sacred rituals alongside the pharaoh, an honor granted to almost no one else. But her power was not just spiritual, it was profoundly economic. The god's wife of Ammon was effectively the CEO of the vast temple estates of Ammon. Remember, this temple was a massive corporation that owned up to a third of the fertile land in Egypt. She controlled this economic empire, overseeing its harvests and its immense treasury. We have legal documents, stelae carved with her decrees, that show her buying and selling land, adopting successors, and managing a vast staff. She was less of a priestess and more of a princess abbess of an incredibly wealthy religious state. Some of these women, like Hatshepsut before she declared herself pharaoh, or later figures like Nitocris I, wielded more real-world power than many of the kings who ruled alongside them. And her role was, by definition, celibate. Her divine marriage to the god Ammon precluded any earthly husband. To ensure a smooth succession of power, the current god's wife would adopt a daughter, usually the daughter of the reigning pharaoh, to be her successor. This created a powerful political and economic lineage of women, running parallel to the male lineage of the pharaohs. The idea that a woman of this stature, a divine consort of the chief god and the head of a multinational corporation, would be involved in any kind of sacred prostitution is not just unlikely, it is utterly laughable. It's like suggesting the modern-day Archbishop of Canterbury moonlights as a Vegas showgirl. The roles are fundamentally, categorically incompatible. The continued scholarly debate over her exact duties is intense. Some historians argue her role was primarily political and economic, a convenient way for pharaohs to control the powerful Theban priesthood. Others insist her religious functions, including potentially intimate but non-sexual rituals performed in the god's inner sanctum, were paramount. But what is not in debate is her status and her celibacy. The god's wife of Ammon is the ultimate inconvenient fact for the myth of the sacred prostitute. She is a powerful, autonomous, celibate female religious authority, sitting right at the heart of the Egyptian temple system. She is the reality, and the fantasy of the alluring temple servant simply cannot coexist in the same space with her. You take your leave of the powerful god's wife of Ammon, her world of high politics and vast estates, feeling a universe away from the smoky, romanticized tales of temple life. You drift back towards the chapel of Hathor, the place where our journey began, drawn once more by the faint, shimmering sound of the sistrum. This time, you're not here to chase a rumor, but to understand the reality of the women who made this sound, the rank-and-file priestesses who form the backbone of the temple's daily ritual life. You find them in a side chamber, a kind of sacred green room preparing for a ceremony. The room is filled with music and a quiet, professional focus. One woman is restringing a tall, gracefully curved harp. Another is tuning a lute, its wooden body polished smooth from centuries of use. A group of younger women are practicing a chant, their voices blending in a low, melodious hum, and many of them are holding the instrument you've come to associate with Hathor, the sistrum. You look at one up close. It's a handle with a U-shaped frame, crossed by thin metal rods threaded with small metal discs. When shaken, it creates that distinctive, rustling, metallic sound. It is not just a musical instrument. It is an object of sacred power. Its sound believed to pacify the gods and embody the creative life force of the universe. These women held titles like Musician of Hathor or Chantress of Ammon. Far from being a scandalous role, this was a highly respectable, often hereditary position. Many of these women came from the families of local elites or priests. Being a temple musician was a sign of good social standing. We have their beautifully decorated coffins, their funerary statues, and inscriptions detailing their lives. They were proud of their tombs. They are shown standing before the gods, sea-strum in hand, forever performing their sacred duty in the afterlife. There is no hint of shame or secrecy, nothing to suggest their role involved anything other than music and song. Their function was essential. In Egyptian theology, the gods were believed to have a temperament. They could be pleased, but they could also become angry, dangerous, and destructive. Music was seen as a vital tool for maintaining cosmic balance. The right hymns, the correct songs, the soothing rattle of the sea-strum, these things helped to keep the gods happy. Music literally kept the universe running smoothly. These women were not just entertainers, they were divine mood regulators, therapists for the gods, whose daily work helped to hold back the forces of chaos. You listen to the chant they are practicing. The lyrics, translated from the hieroglyphs, are not scandalous or suggestive. They are hymns of praise, celebrating the beauty and power of the goddess. Praise to you, Golden One, Mistress of Heaven. We play the sea-strum for your beautiful face. We sing to your glory. It is music of adoration, not seduction. What a foreign visitor might have mistaken for a sensual performance was, in fact, a complex and deeply meaningful liturgical act. Swaying movements of the dancers were not a striptease. They were a form of sign language, a ritualized ballet that told sacred stories. There is a fascinating and ongoing discussion among musicologists and archaeologists about what this ancient music actually sounded like. We have the lyrics from the hymns and we have artistic depictions of musicians playing together. But we don't have a system of musical notation. We don't know the melodies, the rhythms, the harmonies, the rhythms, the harmonies. Was it hypnotic and droning? Was it complex and polyphonic? Scholars are still trying to reconstruct the soundscape of the ancient temple. But it remains one of history's great lost art forms. As the women finish their preparations and file out of the chamber to begin the ceremony, you are left with a new understanding. The fantasy of the sacred prostitute required the temple women to be silent, beautiful objects, their bodies their only offering. But the reality was that these women had a voice. They were skilled professionals, trained artisans of sound. Their offering was not their body, but their breath, their voice, their breath, their musical talent. They filled the temples not with illicit whispers, but with sacred song. The myth was a story about sex, but the truth, it turns out, is a story about music. The last notes of the sacred hymn fade into the stone of the temple, and you feel yourself pulled, as if by an invisible current, away from the public spaces. You leave the grand halls and painted chapels behind. You pass through an unmarked door in a side wall, a door that a normal visitor would never notice, and you step into another world. The cool, incense-laden air of the sanctuary is gone, replaced by the smells of cooking fires, unwashed linen, and hard work. The quiet reverence is replaced by a low hum of ceaseless activity. You are now behind the columns, in the backstage area of the great temple, and this is where the romantic myth breathes its last, dusty gasp. There is no glamour here. The floors are not polished limestone but packed earth. The walls are not covered in vibrant frescoes but are plain, mud-plastered brick. This is the temple's service wing, its engine room, a sprawling complex of workshops, kitchens, and storerooms that is 10 times the size of the public-facing sanctuary. You see a group of women, their backs bent, grinding enormous piles of grain on stone querns. Their work is repetitive, physically demanding, and they will be here from sunrise to sunset. The fine flour they produce will be used to bake the thousands of loaves of bread required for the daily offerings to the gods and to feed the hundreds of people who work here. In another courtyard, you see weavers sitting at large, upright looms. They're not creating sheer, seductive garments, but vast quantities of sturdy, practical linen. This linen will be used for the priests' robes, for temple furnishings, and most importantly, for the endless supply of bandages required for the mummification of sacred animals and wealthy patrons. It is a production line, an ancient factory dedicated to the gods. You see brewers tending to huge ceramic vats of bubbling beer, the staple of the Egyptian diet and a crucial part of every religious offering. You see potters, carpenters, sandal makers, and scribes all toiling away in the service of the temple. And among them are countless women, performing the endless, unglamorous, and capsule institution running. They are not priestesses or musicians. Their titles were simple and direct: grinder, weaver, servant. They haul water from the sacred lake in heavy jars, their shoulders stooped. They scrub the temple floors on their hands and knees, their knuckles raw. They sort lentils, they press oil, they wash the priest's clothing. This is the reality of daily life for the vast majority of women who were connected to the temple. You focus on one woman as she goes about her duties. Her name is lost to history. Her face will never be carved on a tomb wall. She is not a divine wife or a sacred championess. She is a cleaner. Her day began before sunrise and it will end long after dark. Her payment is not in gold or glory, but in daily rations of bread, beer, and oil, enough to keep her and her family alive. She is not here out of a deep sense of spiritual ecstasy, but out of necessity. She might be here because it was the family trade, or because a bad harvest forced her to seek work from the only major employer in town, the temple. Scholars still debate the precise legal status of these low-level workers. Were they free laborers choosing to work for the temple, or were they a form of bonded servant, tied to the institution by debt or by birth? The answer is likely all of the above. The lines between freedom, debt, bondage, and outright slavery were often blurry in the ancient world. But what is certain is that for these women, the temple was not a place of mystery and divine pleasure. It was a workplace. It was a place of sweat, of calloused hands, of aching backs. As you watch this woman quietly go about her work, the beautiful lie of the sacred prostitute seems not just false, but obscene. It is a fantasy woven by privileged men, a story that completely erases the lived reality of the thousands of real women who labored here. It replaced their sweat with perfume, their exhaustion with ecstasy, their servitude with seduction. The myth was interested only in their imagined sexuality. The truth is that their real contribution to the temple was something far more profound and far more difficult. Their endless, back-breaking, anonymous work. You pull your focus away from the individual worker and zoom out, rising high above the temple walls until you can see the entire complex laid out below you like a blueprint. From this vantage point, you begin to understand the true nature of this institution. The sanctuary, the part you first entered with its towering pylons and sacred chapels, is actually just a small, jeweled centerpiece in a much larger and more pragmatic machine. What you're looking at is not primarily a house of prayer. It is a massive economic powerhouse, a corporation with its own CEO, the pharaoh, and a board of directors made up of the high priests. Surrounding the central temple are not just the workshops you just saw, but enormous granaries, their beehive-like domes capable of storing enough grain to feed a city. There is a sprawling treasury, a fortified building where the temple's real wealth, gold, silver, copper, and precious stones, is kept under heavy guard. There is a house of life, which is part university, part library, and part scriptorium, where scribes are trained in sacred, scientific, and medical texts are copied and stored. There is even a sacred lake, a massive, man-made pool where the priests perform their daily purification rituals. But the temple's reach extends far beyond these walls. You see roads leading out into the countryside, and your perspective follows them. They lead to vast tracts of the most fertile farmland in the Nile Valley, all of it owned directly by the temple. You see hundreds, if not thousands, of tenant farmers working these fields. They don't own the land. They work it for their divine landlord, and a significant portion of their harvest goes directly into those massive temple granaries. The temple also owns herds of cattle, flocks of sheep, and fleets of fishing boats. It owns quarries and mines. By the late New Kingdom, it's estimated that the great temple of Amun-Ra Khan, as much as 1/3 of all the arable land in Egypt. It was by a huge margin the single largest economic entity in the country, far wealthier than even the pharaoh himself at times. This economic reality is the key to understanding who really worked in the temples and why. This was not a volunteer organization staffed by the piously devout. It was an employer, a landowner, and a creditor. People came to work for the temple for the same reasons people take jobs today, for a steady wage, in this case paid in rations, and for some it was the only option. And for some, it was not an option at all. This is where we get into the complex and often murky world of temple servitude. The historical records are full of deeds and contracts showing people dedicating themselves to a god. Sometimes this was a pious act by a wealthy individual, but more often, it was a desperate measure. A farmer whose crops failed might pledge himself and his family to the temple in exchange for being fed from its granaries, effectively trading his freedom for survival. His debt would be passed down to his children, binding them to the temple for generations. This is not the same as chattel slavery, where a person is mere property, but it is a form of bonded labor and indentured servitude that could be inescapable. There is still considerable scholarly debate about the exact nature and prevalence of this system. Was it a benevolent social safety net, the ancient equivalent of a welfare state, that saved people from starvation? Or was it an exploitative system of debt peonage that allowed the priestly class to amass enormous power and wealth at the expense of a landless peasantry? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, and it probably varied a great from temple to temple to temple and from century to century. But what is clear is that the temple's workforce was vast, complex, and built on economic necessity. When you understand the temple as a massive agricultural and industrial corporation, the idea of sacred prostitution starts to seem not just culturally unlikely, but economically nonsensical. The temple didn't need to use sex to generate revenue. It had grain, it had gold. Its business was agriculture and administration, not pleasure. The myth proposes a small, boutique industry of sacred love, but the reality was a sprawling, corporate conglomerate of divine agribusiness. You descend from your bird's eye view of the temple corporation and land softly back in the dusty service courtyard. The grand economic and political structures fade into the background, and you are once again face to face with an individual. You are going to meet a woman whose story represents a common, and often heartbreaking, path into temple service. She is not a priestess, not even a paid laborer. She is an indentured servant, a person bound to this place by a piece of paper and a mountain of family debt. Let's call her merit. You see her sifting through a large pile of lentils, her fingers moving with a quick, practiced motion, separating the good ones from the stones and chaff. She is young, perhaps no more than 16. Her linen dress is coarse and patched. There is no joy in her work, only a weary, resigned efficiency. She is here because 2 seasons ago, the Nile's inundation, the annual flood that renewed the fields, was too low. Her family's small plot of land, which they rented from the temple, yielded barely enough to feed themselves, let alone pay the temple its share of the harvest. Her father, faced with starvation for his family, went to the temple scribes and made a deal. The temple would forgive the debt, it would provide them with seed grain for the next planting, and it would give them a small daily ration of bread and beer to survive the lean months. In exchange, he signed a contract, a papyr's deed, pledging his eldest daughter, Merit, to the service of the goddess Mut for a period of 10 years. It was a terrible choice, but for him, it was no choice at all. It was the price of his family's survival. So Merit now belongs to the temple. She sleeps in a communal dormitory with other girls and women in similar situations. Her day is a relentless cycle of chores. She is not being trained as a musician or a chantress. She doesn't have the right family background for that. She is simply an extra pair of hands, assigned to whatever menial task is required, weeding the temple gardens, carrying offerings, and today, sifting lentils. She is, in the legal language of the time, a back servant. You can see the contract in your mind's eye. Archaeologists have found many such documents. They are starkly legalistic. They specify the term of service, the rations to be provided, and the penalties for running away. There is never any mention of sexual duties. That was not part of the contract. Merit's value to the temple is her labor, pure and simple. Her 10 years of unpaid work will more than compensate the temple for her family's forgiven debt. She is an asset on the temple's balance sheet. This is the grim reality that the romantic myth completely papers over. The fantasy suggests that women chose to enter temple service out of divine calling or a desire for a life of sacred pleasure. The reality for many, like Merit, was that there was no choice at all. They were pawns in a desperate game of economic survival. They were not revered priestesses. They were collateral. Now, could a woman like Merit be exploited? Absolutely. She is in a position of extreme vulnerability. She is young, she is poor. She is living in a hierarchical institution controlled entirely by powerful men. The possibility that a priest or a high-ranking temple official might abuse his power and prey upon the women who were legally bound to his service is not just a possibility, it's a grim probability. Such exploitation is a tragic constant of human history in situations of extreme power imbalance. But, and this is the crucial distinction, such an act would have been an abuse of the system, not the purpose of it. It would have been a crime, a violation of Mayet, a source of shame and scandal, not a celebrated sacred rite. The myth imagines a system where this is not only allowed but encouraged and sanctified. The reality is a system where it was likely a hidden, sordid, and profane secret. The story of Merit, the indentured servant, is a sad one, but at least it has a theoretical endpoint. After 10 years, she might be free to leave, to return to her village and try to build a life of her own. But now, you are about to witness a story for which there is no end. You drift from the courtyard where Merit is working to another, more secluded part of the temple's service complex, an area that feels more permanent, more insular. The people who were not just bound to this place for a term of years, but for their entire lives. You see a woman teaching a small group of very young children. They are learning to grind grain on small, child-sized querns. They're licking the movements of their mothers. These children were born here, in the temple. Their mothers were temple slaves, and their fathers were temple slaves. From their very first breath, their fate was sealed. They belong to the god, which in practice means they belong to the temple administration. They will grow up within these walls. They will work for the temple their entire lives, and their own children will inherit the same status. Where did these slaves come from? The answer is a stark reminder of the brutality of the ancient world. Many were the descendants of prisoners of war. When the great pharaohs like Thutmose I or Ramesses II returned from their victorious campaigns in Nubia or Syria, they would bring back thousands of captives. These were not just enemy soldiers, but entire populations, men, women, and children uprooted from their homes and brought to Egypt as human spoils of war. A large portion of this human tribute was donated to the great temples as a pious offering to the gods for granting victory. We have the inscriptions to prove it. A pharaoh will boast on a temple wall, "I have filled the workshops of your temple with the children of the chieftains of Syria." These foreign captives were given Egyptian names. They were taught to speak the Egyptian language, and they were put to work. The men might be sent to labor in the temple's quarries or on its construction projects. The women, like the ones you see here, were often assigned to the weaving workshops or the kitchens. They were a permanent, hereditary workforce, a captive population whose labor belonged to the temple in perpetuity. You focus on the woman teaching the children. Let's call her Tyre. Her great-grandmother might have been captured in a raid on a Canaanite village a century ago. Tyre has never known any other life. This temple is her entire world. She has no concept of a home beyond these sun-baked mud brick walls. Her skills are those the temple requires. She can weave linen of a specific quality. She can prepare the priest's food, and she knows the endless rhythms of the temple's daily chores. She is not unhappy necessarily. This is simply her reality. She has a community here, she has her family, but she has no freedom. This is a side of the Egyptian temple that is often left out of the popular histories. We prefer to think of the pyramids being built by willing and well-fed Egyptian workers, which is largely true. But the great temples of the New Kingdom were sustained by a much more complex and, at times, much more coercive labor system. Again, as with Merit, the primary value of tying her children to the temple is their labor, not their sexuality. But their vulnerability to exploitation is even more profound. As a slave, Tyre has even fewer legal rights and protections than an indentured servant like Marat. The idea that some of these women were forced into sexual servitude by their masters is not just plausible, it is almost certain that it happened. Historians who study slavery throughout history know that this is a depressingly common feature of the institution. But once again, we must stress the distinction. This would have been a brutal reality of slavery, an exercise of raw power, not a sacred religious rite. It was about ownership, not worship. The myth of the sacred prostitute takes this potential horror, this grim reality of human bondage, and wraps it in a beautiful, glittering fantasy of religious ecstasy. It is a cruel and profound distortion of the lives of women who had already lost everything. The abstract categories of indentured servant and hereditary slave dissolve, and you are now tethered to a single consciousness, ready to experience the temple not as a visitor, not as a concept, but as a lived, moment-to-moment reality. You are going to walk through one full day in the life of a low-ranking temple worker. The sun is still hours from rising. The darkness in the long, mud-brick dormitory is absolute, broken only by the soft sounds of 24 other women and girls breathing in their sleep. There is no gentle awakening. A sharp clang from a bronze disc, struck by a temple overseer, shatters the quiet. It is time. Your bed is a simple reed mat on the floor, your muscles already aching in anticipation of the day ahead. There is no time for personal reflection. You and the other women file out into the courtyard, your bare feet cold against the stone flags. Your first task is always the same: water. You pick up 2 heavy, empty ceramic jars and join the silent procession heading towards the sacred lake. You walk to the stone embankment, dip the jars into the cool, dark water, and then begin the agonizing process of lifting them onto your shoulders using a wooden yoke to balance the weight. The journey back to the temple kitchens is a slow, painful shuffle. The water swashes, the yoke digs into your bones, and every step is a negotiation with gravity. You will make this trip 4 more times before the sun even clears the horizon. This water will be used for everything: for the priests to perform their ritual ablutions, for the cooks to boil grain, for the cleaners to scrub the floors. As you pour the last jar into a large cistern, your shoulders are screaming in protest. But there is no time for rest. You move to the grinding room. It's a dusty, noisy chamber filled with long, saddle-shaped stones called querns. Your station is waiting for you. You kneel, take a handful of barley from a basket, and begin to grind, pushing a smaller, loaf-shaped stone back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, over the grain. The sound is a constant, gritty roar. The air is thick with flour dust that coats your skin, your hair, and the inside of your throat. This is the central, driving rhythm of the temple's existence. The gods must be fed. Every day, the temple ritual requires a specific number of perfectly formed loaves of bread to be placed on the offering tables. Without this flour, the entire divine system grinds to a halt. Your repetitive, mind-numbing labor is, in the grand scheme of things, the very foundation of cosmic order. As the sun finally rises, you can hear the faint sounds of chanting and sea drums from the inner sanctuary. The high priests are performing the morning ceremony. They are waking the god statue, purifying it with water and natron, dressing it in fine linen, and anointing it with precious oils. They are presenting it with the fruits of your labor, the bread, the beer, the meat, and the wine. The god, they believe, mystically consumes the spiritual essence of the food. An hour later, the ceremony is over. And this is where a fascinating and deeply practical bit of theology comes into play. The food, its spiritual essence now consumed, undergoes a reversion of offerings. It is brought out of the sanctuary and is first distributed among the high-ranking priests. This is their main source of income, a divine salary paid in prime cuts of meat and the finest bread. What they don't want is then passed down to the lower-ranking priests and temple officials. By the time any of it reaches you, the woman who ground the flour, it is the leftovers of the leftovers. Your midday meal will be a small, coarse loaf of barley bread and a cup of weak beer, eaten quickly in a hot, sun-drenched courtyard. The afternoon is for cleaning. The great hypostyle hall, where tourists now wander in awe, must be swept. The offering chapels must be washed. You are given a bucket and a rough cloth and set to work scrubbing the vast stone floors. It is back-breaking work, on your hands and knees, erasing the footprints of the priests and the dust of the day. And as you work, your mind is likely not filled with pious thoughts. This is a point that historians still fiercely debate. Did these laborers feel a profound connection to the gods, a sense of purpose in their toil? Or was it just a job, a means of survival, their minds occupied by the ache in their back, a worry about a sick child, or a simple, numbing thought for the moment the day would end? We can never know. As dusk falls, you are given one final task, checking the oil in the dozens of small pottery lamps that dot the temple's corridors, trimming the flax wicks, and lighting them against the coming dark. Your work is finally done. You receive your evening ration and return to the dormitory, collapsing onto your reed mat. You have worked for over 12 hours. You have hauled ground, scrubbed, and cleaned. You have not reclined on silken cushions or engaged in ecstatic mysteries. And in a few short hours the bronze disc will clang again, and you will do it all over again. The image of the woman collapsing onto her reed mat after a day of grueling labor remains with you. Her exhaustion is palpable. Her reality was one of endless, repetitive tasks, of aching muscles under life lived at the very bottom of a rigid social hierarchy. And it is in this context, in the stark reality of her powerlessness, that we must confront the darkest possibility, the one that the romantic myth so cleverly and cruelly hides. We need to consider the grim reality of exploitation. Let's imagine a scenario. It is late at night in the temple complex. The ceremonies are over, the pilgrims have gone home, and a deep quiet has settled over the sacred precincts. A high-ranking priest, a man of immense power and influence, summons a young temple servant to his private quarters. He doesn't summon a child from a good family or the daughter of a local official. He summons a girl like Marit, the indentured servant who is bound here by debt, or a woman like Tyr, the temple slave, who is legally his property, or rather, the property of the god he serves. When she arrives, there is no talk of sacred rites or divine union. There is no pretense of religious ecstasy. There is only a command, born of a stark and brutal power imbalance. She is alone, isolated from her family, and utterly dependent on this man for her daily ration of food. He is her master, her keeper, her connection to the entire temple bureaucracy. To refuse him could mean punishment, a reduction in rations, the transfer to an even more grueling job, or worse, to resist could be seen as an act of rebellion against the temple itself. And who would she complain to? The other priests are his colleagues, his friends. The temple administration is him. She has no recourse, no one to protect her. This is the hidden, ugly truth that likely lurked in the shadows of the temple. Not a glamorous, sanctified ritual, but the timeless, sordid reality of sexual exploitation. It would not have been called worship. It would have been called what it was, an abuse of power. It would have been a secret, a source of shame for the victim and a profane act for the perpetrator, a gross violation of the principles of Maya. And this is where the myth does its most insidious work. The fantasy of the sacred prostitute takes this grim potential for abuse and reframes it as something beautiful, spiritual, and consensual. It creates a narrative where the woman is not a victim, but a willing participant, a holy vessel. It transforms a potential act of coercion into a pious act of devotion. It provides a perfect, ready-made justification for the exploitation of the powerless. The priest in our scenario is no longer an abuser. He's a spiritual guide, initiating a devotee into the sacred mysteries. The young woman is no longer being exploited, she's being honored, chosen for a special role. This is why dismantling the myth is so important. It's not just about correcting a dry academic mistake. It's about refusing to participate in the romanticization of what was, for many women, a life of profound vulnerability and potential suffering. The myth is a comfortable fantasy for the powerful. It allows us to look back at this ancient world and imagine a sensuous, spiritual paradise rather than confronting the uncomfortable realities of class, slavery, and gender inequality. There's a heated and ongoing academic conversation about how to even approach this topic. Some historians argue that without direct textual evidence of either sacred prostitution or sexual abuse, we should refrain from speculating. They contend that we must stick only to what the Egyptians themselves wrote down. Others argue that this is a naive approach, that human nature and the dynamics of power are constants. They believe that to ignore the high probability of such exploitation, simply because the victims left no written record of their suffering, is a failure of historical empathy. It is to let the silence of the powerless be the final word. So, while we will likely never know the specific stories of these women, we can be almost certain that such things happened. But they happened in the shadows, in the moral darkness, outside the sanctioned system of belief. The real tragedy is that for centuries, the beautiful lie of the sacred prostitute has inadvertently provided a kind of retroactive cover for this abuse, painting a veneer of spiritual legitimacy over what was almost certainly a very human and very ugly reality. Let's leave the dark, speculative shadows of the temple's hidden corners and return to the man who started this whole story, the Greek and Roman writers. You find yourself back in that Athenian symposium, the scent of wine and olive oil in the air. Herodotus is telling his tales, and his audience is captivated. We've established that the story of the sacred prostitute is likely a fantasy, a ghost created from mistrustration, cultural confusion, and perhaps a mischievous tour guide. But now we must ask a deeper question. Why was this particular ghost so eagerly welcomed? Why were these intelligent, educated men so ready and willing to believe these sensational stories about Egypt? The answer lies in the complex relationship the Greeks and later, they were utterly fascinated by it. To them, Egypt was the ancient of ancients, a civilization that was already old and mysterious when their own was in its infancy. They looked at the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the great temples of Karnak with a sense of profound awe and envy. They knew they were newcomers on the world stage, and Egypt was the wise, inscrutable, and impossibly ancient grandparent. But this all was mixed with a deep-seated sense of their own cultural superiority. They were the rationalists, the philosophers, the democrats. The Egyptians, in their view, were different. They were despotic, ruled by a god-king pharaoh. They were superstitious, worshipping gods with the heads of animals. They were obsessed with death and the afterlife, building colossal tombs and spending fortunes on mummification. And, as Herodotus noted, their social customs often seemed to be the complete reverse of the Greek norm. This combination of awe and condescension created a powerful psychological need to see Egypt as fundamentally other. It had to be a land of wonders, but also a land of strange, exotic, and slightly decadent behavior. The story of sacred prostitution fit this narrative perfectly. It was exotic, it was sensual, and it was a practice that was considered both shocking and vaguely titillating to the Greek male imagination. It confirmed their idea of Egypt as a place where the normal rules of society were suspended, a land of ancient, primal magic that was beyond their rational comprehension. It's a phenomenon we see throughout history, what the scholar Edward said would later call Oriental mist, the tendency of Western cultures to project a set of fantasies and stereotypes onto the cultures of the East. The Orient becomes a screen upon which the West projects its own repressed desires and fears, seeing it as a place of sensuality, cruelty, and irrationality. There was also a very practical, and perhaps cynical, reason for these stories to flourish. Writers like Herodotus were, in a sense, entertainers. They were part of a competitive oral culture where a storyteller's reputation depended on his ability to captivate an audience. A dry lecture on the Egyptian agricultural economy would have put his listeners to sleep, but a whispered tale of secret rites in the temple of a love goddess. That was a story that would be remembered retold, and would ensure a big crowd for his next public reading. Sex and scandal have always sold, whether on a papyrus scroll or a modern tabloid website. Historians still argue about the intentions of these ancient writers. Were they deliberately creating a false, almost propagandistic, image of Egypt to make their own culture look more rational and civilized by comparison? Or were they genuinely trying to understand a foreign culture through their own limited and biased worldview, like a person trying to describe the color blue to someone who has only ever seen red? The most likely answer is a mixture of both, carrying all its cultural baggage, but they were also individuals with their own motives and ambitions. What's certain is that their gaze was not neutral. It was a foreign male gaze, looking at Egyptian women and seeing not individuals, not priests, musicians, weavers or slaves, but symbols. They saw symbols of a mysterious, feminine, and dangerously alluring culture. They weren't really interested in the reality of these women's lives. They were interested in the stories these women could be made to tell about Egypt itself, and the story they wanted to hear was one of ancient secrets and sacred sensuality. So that is the story they told. The scent of Greek wine and the sounds of the lyre dissolve, and you are transported forward in time and space. You are no longer in Athens or on the banks of the Nile. You are now in the heart of a new, sprawling empire, Rome. The city is a chaotic, noisy, magnificent mess. It's a city of marble temples and squalid apartment blocks, of unimaginable wealth and desperate poverty. And in this bustling cosmopolitan metropolis, the gods of Egypt have found a new and wildly popular home. You see a temple that looks strangely familiar yet different. It has Egyptian motifs, sphinxes, obelisks, and images of the goddess Isis, but they are carved in a distinctly Roman style. The worshippers streaming in and out are not Egyptians, but Romans from every walk of life, senators, wives, soldiers, merchants, and slaves. The cult of Isis, which had absorbed many of the characteristics of Hathor, had become one of the most popular mystery religions in the Roman Empire. But as the cult traveled, its reputation was remixed, reinterpreted, and often scandalized by the Roman authorities. For the traditional Roman elite, Isis was a problem. Unlike the stately, predictable gods of the Roman state pantheon like Jupiter and Mars, Isis was seen as foreign, emotional, and dangerously popular with women in the lower classes. Her priests, with their shaved heads and linen robes, seemed effeminate. Her rituals, with their exotic music and promises of personal salvation and an afterlife, seemed to undermine the traditional Roman focus on duty to the state. The cult was seen as a source of potential subversion, a threat to the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. It is in this atmosphere of suspicion and moral panic that the old whispers about sacred sexuality find fertile new ground and bloom into a full-blown, lurid scandal. Roman satirists and moralizing poets, like Juvenal and Propertius, seize upon the cult of Isis as a perfect target. They write scathing, oft unwildly exaggerated, accounts of what supposedly went on in her temples. They paint them as dens of iniquity, places where respectable Roman matrons would go to engage in secret trysts and all sorts of decadent, practices, far from the watchful eyes of their husbands. You can almost hear the voice of a Roman poet declaiming his work to a laughing crowd at a dinner party. He describes a noblewoman who, bewitched by the superstitions of Isis, abandons her family duties. He hints at secret, orgiastic rites that happen in the darkness of the temple's inner sanctum. He might even tell a story about the priests of Isis acting as go-betweens for illicit affairs, the temple becoming a divinely sanctioned meeting place for lovers. The old story of sacred prostitution, which was a vague rumor in Herodotus, is now transformed into a detailed accusation of widespread sexual depravity. How much of this was true? The scholarly consensus is very little. Archaeologists have excavated IAC temples in Pompeii and elsewhere, and they look like temples. There's no evidence they were designed for the kind of activities the satirists described. For the vast majority of its followers, the cult of Isis was a source of profound spiritual comfort, a promise of a personal connection with a compassionate, motherly goddess who would guide them through the trials of this life and into the next. But this quiet, personal faith doesn't make for a good story. Scandal does. The Roman authorities were deeply suspicious of the cult. On several occasions, the Senate ordered the temples of Isis in Rome to be destroyed, and her cult was officially suppressed. These actions were often justified by citing a particular scandal, real or invented, involving sexual impropriety at a temple. The myth of Egyptian sexual decadence was no longer just a curious traveler's tale, it had been weaponized. It became a tool of political and cultural suppression, a way to slander a popular religion by associating it with sexual immorality. And so the lie deepens. What started as a Greek misunderstanding of Egyptian culture is now a Roman political smear campaign. The phantom of the sacred prostitute has been given a new job. She is no longer just a symbol of everything that traditional Romans feared: foreign influence, female autonomy, and the breakdown of traditional moral order. The story is now more powerful than ever, not because there is any new evidence for it, but because it has become incredibly useful. The marble temples of Rome crumble into dust. The satirical poems are rolled up and stored away in lost libraries, and the long silence of 1,000 years descends. The gods of Egypt are forgotten, their language unreadable, their temples buried beneath the sand. The myth of the sacred prostitute, along with so much of the ancient world, goes into a deep hibernation. And then, it reawakens. You find yourself in a different time, a different climate. You are in the damp, foggy London of the 19th century. The air is thick with the smoke of coal fires. You are in the hallowed halls of a great museum, or perhaps the exclusive library of a gentleman's club. The men here are the new high priests of history. They are archaeologists, classicists, and amateur scholars, flush with the confidence of a British Empire that spanned the globe. They are the ones who are rediscovering the ancient world, funding expeditions to Egypt and bringing back mummies, statues, and papier by the shipload. As they begin to decipher the hieroglyphs, a new wave of Egyptomania sweeps across Europe. And as they read the old Greek and Roman texts, Herodotus, Juvenal, the poets, they rediscover the dormant myth of the sacred prostitute. And they don't just rediscover it, they fall in love with it. For the Victorian-made imagination, trapped in a society of rigid social propriety and officially repressed sexuality, this story was an intoxicating fantasy. You are watching a group of these scholars, their faces illuminated by the gaslight, poring over a newly translated text. They read the old whispers and scandals, and they accept them not just as truth, but as a profound insight into the Oriental mind. The story confirms all of their own biases and prejudices. They see the ancient world, and particularly the East, as a place of primitive passions, of languid sensuality, a place free from the moral constraints of their own Christian society. The sacred prostitute becomes a key exhibit in their imagined museum of ancient decadence. But they add their own unique, Victorian spin to the tale. They don't just see her as a promiscuous figure, they romanticize her. She becomes a tragic heroine, a beautiful, doomed priestess trapped in a life of gilded sin. She is both pure and profane, a vessel for the divine and an object of desire. This internal contradiction makes her an incredibly compelling figure for an era that was obsessed with the idea of the fallen woman. They write novels about her, grand, sweeping historical epics filled with melodrama, unquestionable history. They paint enormous, opulent canvases depicting her, draped in diaphanous veils, reclining on leopard skins in a torchlit temple, her kohl-rimmed eyes gazing into the distance. This Victorian fantasy is a crucial step in the myth's evolution. It sanitizes the story, the grim realities of coercion, slavery, and exploitation that we have considered are completely erased. In their place as a tragic, beautiful romance, the power imbalance is transformed into a spiritual drama. This makes the myth much more palatable, more acceptable for a popular audience. It's no longer a sordid whisper. It's a grand, poetic tragedy. There is a profound and ongoing academic discussion about the psychological underpinnings of this Victorian obsession. Some scholars argue it was a straightforward projection of repressed sexual desire. Others see it as a more complex expression of colonial attitudes, where the feminized, sensual East was seen as waiting to be dominated and understood by the masculine, rational West. The temple priestess, in this reading, becomes a metaphor for the land of Egypt itself, ancient, mysterious, and passively available to the European explorer. Whatever the reason, the result is clear. The 19th century scholars and artists took the fragile, unsubstantiated rumor from the ancient world and gave it a solid, heavyweight, gilt-framed form. They dressed it up in the language of academic authority and the glamour of high art. They took a ghost and convinced the world it was a queen. And this is the version of the myth, the romantic, tragic, and utterly false version that they would hand down to the 20th century and to the new, powerful storytelling medium that was waiting just around the corner of the cinema. The gas lights of the Victorian study flicker and die, replaced by a much brighter, harsher light. You hear the whirring of a projector and the faint crackle of a film reel. You are now in the ultimate dream factory, the place where myths are given their final, most enduring form, Hollywood. It's the 1920s, and the discovery of Tutankhamun has unleashed a global craze for all things Egyptian. The movie studios, always with a keen sense for what the public wants, are ready to cash in. You find yourself on a vast, sprawling film set in the California desert. Hundreds of extras in loincloths and linen dresses mill about under the hot sun. In front of you is a colossal, plaster and plywood recreation of an Egyptian temple, 10 times more grand and gaudy than anything the real Egyptians ever built. This is the world of the silent film epic, a world of grand gestures, heaving bosoms, and smouldering glances. And the story they are about to film is a familiar one. It's the story of the temple priestess, the beautiful servant of a strange pagan god, torn between her sacred vows and her love for a heroic adventurer who is, of course, a handsome, clean-cut American. The Victorian fantasy, with its tragic romance and exotic sensuality, is a perfect fit for the silver screen. In the hands of directors like Cecil B. DeMille, the myth is supercharged. The temple is no longer just a place of worship. It's a cavernous hall of idols, with smoke machines pumping out mystical fog and dozens of scantily clad temple dancers, performing vaguely Oriental-inspired choreography. The priestess herself, played by a glamorous movie star, is draped in shimmering, sheer costumes that would have scandalized a real Egyptian and were designed to tantalize the film censors of the day. You watch a scene being filmed. The high priestess of Isis or some other vaguely Egyptian-sounding goddess is performing a sacred rite. It involves a lot of swaying, arm-waving, and staring hypnotically into the camera. The subtext is clear. This is a woman of dangerous, mystical sensuality. The historical reality of the temple musicians with their sea strums, the powerful sea, all like God's wife of Ammon, the exhausted weavers and grinders. All of this is gone. It has been replaced by a single, powerful, and completely fictional archetype, the vamp, the exotic seductress who uses her religious role as a cover for her amorous intentions. As cinema transitions from silent films to the talkies, and then to glorious technicolor, the myth is told and retold, each time becoming more entrenched in the popular imagination. The 1956 epic The Ten Commandments, for example, features a memorable scene where a group of temple dancers perform before the golden calf, their wild, orgiastic celebration presented as the epitome of pagan depravity. For millions of viewers, these images became their primary, and often only, source of information about ancient Egyptian religion. The Hollywood version became the historical reality. It's important to understand that the filmmakers were not, for the most part, trying to deliberately mislead people. They were drawing on a century of popular novels, paintings, and scholarship that had already established the myth. They were simply taking the most dramatic, most visually interesting, and most commercially viable version of the story and putting it on screen. They were in the business of selling fantasy, not fact, and the fantasy of the sacred prostitute was a bestseller. There's a fascinating, ongoing debate among film historians and cultural critics about the legacy of these films. On the one hand, they sparked an interest in ancient Egypt for millions of people, who might otherwise have never thought about it. They were a gateway, a first step into a fascinating world. On the other hand, they cemented a series of harmful and inaccurate stereotypes that archaeologists and historians have been trying to correct ever since. 500-year-old lion broadcasted to the entire planet in breathtaking color and stereo sound. After Hollywood was done with it, the beautiful lie was no longer just a myth, it was a memory. People felt like they had seen it with their own eyes. The bright, artificial lights of the Hollywood set dim, and the larger-than-life fantasies of the silver screen fade to grey. We have come to the end of our long detour through the minds of Greek historians, Roman satirists, Victorian scholars, and Hollywood directors. We have chased the ghost of the sacred prostitute through millennia of misinterpretation and romanticization. Now it's time to let the ghost rest. we return one last time to the quiet, sun-baked reality of the Egyptian temple and assemble the facts. Let's build a clear, evidence-based picture of what we truly know about the women who served these gods. So who were they? We know from countless inscriptions, statues, and legal documents that women could and did hold a wide variety of official roles within the temple hierarchy. At the absolute pinnacle, you had the god's wife of Ammon, a position of immense political and economic power, held by a celibate woman who acted as the spiritual consort of the state god and the chief administrator of his vast estates. She was a CEO, not a court saint. Below her were a host of other priestess roles. We have titles like overseer of the female musicians of the temple or chief attendant of the goddess. These were high-status, supervisory positions held by women from elite families. They were managers responsible for organizing the ritual life of the temple's female staff. They were respected public figures, not hidden figures of a sensual cult. Then you had the largest group of official female religious specialists, the musicians, the chantresses, and the dancers, the shimayet. These were the skilled professionals whose job was to create the sacred soundscape of the temple. They were the performers who soothed the gods with the shaking of the sea-strum and the singing of hymns. This was a respectable, often hereditary profession. Their role was liturgical, not sexual. Their contribution was their artistic skill, not their bodies. This is the picture of the official, public-facing roles. But the vast majority of women connected to the temple were not priestesses or performers. They were the workers, the weavers, the grinders, the brewers. They were the anonymous laborers who kept the great temple corporation running, and these women fell into different legal categories. Some were free laborers, paid in daily rations. Many others, as we've seen, were indentured servants, bound to the temple by the debts of their families. And a significant number were hereditary slaves, the descendants of prisoners of war who belonged to the temple for life. For these women, the temple was simply a place of endless, back-breaking toil, a world of profound powerlessness where the threat of exploitation was likely a constant, grim reality. And that is the picture. A complex, highly stratified society of women, ranging from one of the most powerful people in the country to the most powerless. It's a picture that includes powerful executives, respected artists, skilled artisans, and exploited laborers. The academic world, after decades of debate, has largely reached a consensus on this. While the idea still lingers in popular culture, the overwhelming majority of modern Egyptologists and historians consider the myth of sacred prostitution in Egypt to be just that. A myth. A persistent, fascinating, and powerful myth. But a myth nonetheless. There is simply no good evidence to support it, and a mountain of evidence that points to a very different reality. The ongoing debate has shifted. It's no longer about if sacred prostitution existed, but rather why the myth of its existence has been so incredibly durable for 2,500 years. So as you stand in the quiet temple courtyard, the true story comes into focus. It's a story that is less sensational, less romantic, but infinitely more human. It is not a story of sacred sexuality, but a story of female power, of artistic expression, of economic necessity, and of the quiet, often unrecorded, dignity of labor. It is a story of real women, in all their complexity, whose lives' worth are more interesting and meaningful than the one-dimensional fantasy that has overshadowed them for so long. The facts are assembled, the evidence is weighed, and the case for the most part is closed. The sacred prostitute of the Egyptian temple was a phantom, a ghost haunting the pages of history. But as you stand in the fading light of the Egyptian evening, one final, nagging question remains: why? Why has this particular ghost refused to be laid to rest? Why has this lie, born of a misunderstanding to under half millennia ago, survived and thrived, passed down from generation to generation like a precious heirloom? The first reason is simple: it's a good story. It has all the elements of a timeless bestseller, a secret, forbidden world, the allure of the exotic, and the potent, irresistible combination of sex and religion. It's a story that is inherently more exciting, more memorable, and more titillating than the complex, often mundane reality of temple administration, liturgical music, and agricultural economics. The truth is that a woman spending 12 hours a day grinding grain is a story of labor. A woman offering her body in a sacred rite is a story of mystery and passion. And human beings have always been drawn to the better story, regardless of its truthfulness. The second reason is that the myth is incredibly useful. As we've seen, it has served the purposes of many different groups over the centuries. For the ancient Greeks, it helped to define Egypt as other, a land of strange and exotic customs that reinforced their own sense of cultural superiority. For the Romans, it was a convenient political weapon, a way to slander and suppress a popular for uncult by associating it with immorality. It was a perfect screen onto which they could project their own repressed desires and colonial fantasies. And for Hollywood, it was simply great box office, a reliable formula for selling tickets. The myth has survived because it has always been adaptable, always ready to be repurposed to fit the needs and biases of the present. But there is a third, perhaps deeper reason for the lie's persistence. It speaks to a genuine and profound human curiosity about the relationship between spirituality and the physical body. The idea that sexuality, one of the most powerful and fundamental human drives, could be integrated into our spiritual lives, that it could be a path to the divine rather than a distraction from it, is a powerful and recurring theme in many cultures. The myth of the sacred prostitute, in its most idealized form, touches upon this deep-seated longing. It presents a fantasy of a world where the sacred and the sensual are not in conflict but are beautifully, seamlessly intertwined. It offers a vision of a religion that celebrates the body instead of denying it. This is a vision that many people, in many different eras, have found deeply attractive, especially when contrasted with their own, often more ascetic, religious traditions. The problem is that in our desire for this beautiful idea, we have projected it onto a culture where it doesn't seem to have belonged. We wanted the ancient Egyptians to be the practitioners of this sacred sensuality, so we chose to believe the stories that said they were, ignoring the vast silence from the Egyptians themselves. There are, of course, genuine spiritual traditions in the world, such as some forms of Tantra that do explore the intersection of the spiritual and the sexual. But the scholarly consensus is that ancient Egypt was not one of them. And so the myth endures, a complex tapestry woven from three threads: the thread of a good story, the thread of cultural bias, and the thread of genuine spiritual longing. It persists in popular books, in television documentaries, and in the endless, echoed chamber of the internet. It has become a kind of historical urban legend, a story that feels so true, so right, that it has become immune to the boring, complicated facts. It has achieved a life of its own, completely separate from the historical reality it claims to describe. It is no longer a lie about history. It is a truth about our own desires, our own prejudices, and our own enduring need for a good story. The evening air grows cooler now. The last of the day's heat is bleeding out from the great stone walls of the temple. A final procession of priests, their white robes looking grey in the twilight, move silently towards the inner sanctuary to perform the closing rituals, the rites that will put the god and the temple itself to sleep for the night. You turn and you begin to walk away, your footsteps the only sound in the vast, empty courtyard. But you are not leaving as the same person who arrived. You came here chasing a golden, glittering fantasy. You are leaving with the heavier, more substantial weight of a complicated truth. Your journey is complete. You have seen the myth in all its alluring glory, and you have watched it crumble under the quiet, steady pressure of evidence. You have met the real women of the temple. You have stood in the presence of the powerful god's wife of Ammon, a celibate CEO in priestesses' robes. You have listened to the sacred music of the chantresses, respected professionals practicing their art, and you have felt the silent exhaustion of the weavers, the grinders, the cleaners, the women whose anonymous labor was the true foundation of this entire sacred enterprise. You understand now that the truth was never a single story. It was a complex social and economic system, a world of class and status, of law and labor, of debt and devotion. It is so much messier than the simple, elegant lie of the sacred prostitute. And perhaps that is another reason the lie has survived so long. It is easy. It requires no understanding of agricultural economics or the nuances of legal contracts. It is a simple, beautiful, and ultimately empty story. The truth is difficult, and it requires empathy. As you pass through the great pylon gate for the last time, you look back at the walls, now turning a deep purple in the fading light. They are covered in thousands of hieroglyphs. For centuries, people looked at these carvings and saw what they wanted to see: mystical symbols, secret magical spells, an inscrutable and exotic code. They were wrong. When Champollion finally deciphered them, he revealed that they were not magic, but something far more wonderful, a living, functional language, capable of recording everything from grand royal decrees to a simple laundry list. And in a way, your journey has been a similar act of decipherment. You looked past the fantasy of the exotic symbol and found the real, functional lives of the women who lived here. You step out of the temple precinct and back into the sounds and smells of the living world. You can hear the laughter of children playing in the dusk, the smell of cooking fires from the nearby village. Life goes on as it always has. And this is where our knowledge and our story must end. For historians still debate the final, unanswerable question: what did the average woman in that village, or the woman scrubbing the temple floor, truly believe in her heart? Carved in stone for eternity. But the quiet, personal, folk religion of the ordinary person, their private fears and hopes whispered to a household god, that is a history that was rarely written down, and it is lost to us forever. The hieroglyphs on the wall are silent on this, the most human question of all. And so, the great stone gates of the temple swing shut, not with a crash, but with a soft, final sigh. The dust of our journey begins to settle, each particle finding its own place to rest in the deep and comfortable quiet of the night. The story is now a memory, a series of images that can begin to soften and blur at the edges, like watercolor paintings in a gentle rain. You can let the details go now. The names, the titles, the arguments of historians, they can all drift away like small wooden boats floating down a very long, very slow river. The river is the Nile, perhaps, flowing silently through a sleeping land under a vast canopy of stars. And you are in one of those boats, not guiding it, not rowing, but simply allowing its gentle current to carry you. The air is warm and smells of lotus flowers and cool water. The only sound is the soft lapping of the river against the hull of the boat, a slow, steady, rhythmic sound, a sound not unlike your own breathing as you drift deeper and deeper into a place of perfect calm. The sharp lines of the waking world have dissolved, and there is nothing left to do, nothing left to understand. There is only this gentle, floating sensation, this slow, easy drift towards the soft shores of sleep. The final word has been whispered. If your mind is still gently stirring, you're welcome to drift into another of my stories. If not, I wish you a deep and peaceful slumber. Good night.